Good morning. Thank you for coming out to drive. It's great to have all of you guys here today. They say when you're young, you should probably try to figure out what you want to be when you grow up. And fortunately for most of us, they don't put a timeline on that. And despite this next presenter's English degree, I think he had a fairly good idea of what he wanted to do when he was growing up. You're going to get to see and hear from a gentleman who, in our line of work, is a rare mix of both a visionary and somebody with a great sense and deal of technical competency with what it is that we do. And Mike is always a little bit ahead of the curve on some of these topics that we're going to talk about today. And I think that as he presents his buffet of knowledge and experience and principles and points to get across, I hope everyone will eat and eat heartily. He's got a lot of great stuff for you guys to do. So, without any further ado, Mike, will you come up here? Mike Messiah from the University of Washington.
Thanks, Chris. I didn't know. I thought maybe I was in the wrong room. And buffet of knowledge. I've not heard that one before. I'll let you know. I've not done this before, so I'm hoping it goes well. But we'll see. So. I had kind of a lot of ways that I could go with this, and I wasn't really sure what to expect. So what you're going to hear here is probably skewed toward the general, but I'm more than happy to go into some specifics about what we do at the University of Washington or what I've seen done elsewhere. I'd really like this to be a conversation, so if there are questions as we go, please feel free to ask them. And certainly afterwards, if there's anyone who wants to get in touch with me to go into some more specifics, I don't want anyone to feel like they didn't get enough information out of this. But at the same time, I know at UW we're lucky to be a little bit resource heavy, so there's a lot of stuff that we do that may not be right in the ballpark of stuff that you can take on. So. I went out and pulled up some stats from the Census Bureau yesterday, and so I kind of calculated in the hour that we're going to be talking here some of the interesting things that will happen. I suppose there won't be many weddings during this hour, but just divided for the year. So as you can tell, though, you're up against some. You're going up a pretty steep hill here trying to maintain data in your CRM. We know that about 15% of people in the United States move in any given year, so just keeping track of addresses is a big job. But when you add to that phone number and email and employment, it gets pretty crazy. So what I'm going to talk about here is what are some of the things that you encounter in your database that end up getting exposed in reports and in segmentation and generally make you look bad. You know what would help me? Could I get a sense of, are most of the people here doing reporting for their, I mean, how many people are on the sort of reporting side of IT? And then I guess how many of you are maybe users or database? Okay, all right, so it's a pretty good mix. Tell me.
Between reporting and data.
What's that?
What's the difference between reporting and data?
Well,
I'm not sure how
that's a great question. So generally, I think the way a lot of shops are organized is you have the team that kind of maintains the data in the database. Is in charge of data acquisition, cleaning the data, manual data entry and batch data entry, and then you have a reporting group that is basically in charge of going in there and getting information out for the users. I know that's not always the case. In a lot of nonprofits, the bulk of the data management is actually done by gift processing, for instance, because they tend to be the ones that are in there most often working with records. So, at the University of Washington, we've decoupled the gift processing from the records management side. Yeah, and in some places, you know, it's one or two people doing the whole thing. So this is this is a list here that I pulled from. It's a group called the Cutter Consortium, and they kind of listed out the specific types of dirty data. I'm not sure I like that phrase, dirty data. It sounds kind of weird. But these are the things that you're going to encounter, and so what I'll be talking about here are specifically the techniques we use to try to tackle these issues. So there's a couple things I probably want to highlight here. I added the sixth thing, incomplete data sets, to this list. They talk in their definition of bad data about having missing columns. So this is where you have a record that's missing part of the address or part of the name. But I think an equally big problem for large databases is when you have missing rows. So you have something in the database that looks like you've got all of your donors or all of your alumni or all of your participants from a certain event, but it turns out they're not all there. And so incomplete, missing data rows is in some ways even worse, because when you're missing columns, that tends to be pretty obvious. When you're missing rows, nobody may notice that they pulled a report thinking they're getting all the people who attended an event or RSVP to an event, but they're not. So I think that's an important one to point out. Number 3, multiple scattered databases with differing structures and varied levels of maintenance. That's huge at the University of Washington. I mean, we have databases all over the place, and not one of them is from the same vendor package. A lot of them are home built. So in our incoming, we get all kinds of stuff. All right, so this is a framework for data integration. And I'm actually kind of joking here. This is not what I'm going to discuss. It's sort of ridiculous, but my second degree was in information management for the iSchool at the University of Washington. This is the kind of stuff that they love. But I think there's something kind of useful to be pulled out of this. And in this model, this is looking at a CRM database that has 3 different sources for what's populating it. And these are different processes that are used to get the data into the CRM. I'll be honest with you, I don't even know what the function symbols are all about. But the thing that I thought was interesting about this model is they talk about the quality of data, quality of the model, and quality of the process. And whatever you want to call it, I think those are 3 really good concepts to keep in mind when you're trying to design your own maintenance system. Because some of those things you can't control. When you're talking about external data, you can't really control the quality of the model. If you're connecting to give you an example, maybe the student database doesn't really have good information about parents, because at the time they started tracking parents, it wasn't, all they need to know is where to send them a bill. But in fundraising, you want to know a lot more than that. So they just don't have that information. I can't go to the registrar's office and say, I need you to separate parents from the kids and separate spouses and track them all separately. I just don't get to do that. Quality of the processes tend to be something I think that you can control, but again, you run up against resource constraints. So I can envision a process that goes out and pulls data and cleans it up and pumps it into my CRM. Can I actually build that? Do I have the resources to maintain that? Can I connect all the different things I want to connect? Theoretically you can control that, but in reality you don't always get to do that. And then the quality of the data itself. And I think that's where you have the most control. I like to think of it this way. I can't really control it before it gets into the CRM, but once it's there, it's mine. And there's all kinds of stuff I can do to try to get that data in better shape. And across the board, there's a lot of places where we'll pull in stuff that's incomplete, but we're able to merge it with some other source we have. We're able to operate against it with some third-party software that helps us clean up things or add additional metadata. And at the end of the day, we have something pretty good. And then the other thing that helps is if you can expose that to your users, they're ultimately going to be the best people for getting data into good shape. So yeah, I'm not going to really talk about the model. Here's my agenda really here is just going to be laying the foundation. I get to, I'm excited to talk about a sort of a records management plan, because I took over records management at the University of Washington having really no idea what I was doing. I came at it from, my background was in annual giving. I had a degree in English. Shakespeare wasn't in our database, so I was at a disadvantage there from the beginning. And when I took over, we had an updates team that was receiving update requests from end users, and they had a 6,000 request backlog. They were literally months behind. They had stuff hidden in drawers that it was months old. Kind of funny to think about it now, but the real byproduct of that was that people didn't trust that they could request something in the CRM and see it updated. They didn't trust that when they were looking at something in the CRM that was fresh information. And so consequently, people started, they would take a report from the reporting group and stash that away and make that their own little CRM. I can pull a mailing list in fall of 2002 and try to maintain it myself, so at least I have something in fall of 2003 that I can mail to. And that becomes a disaster. So the effects of being that far behind were huge for us. So I had to kind of put together a game plan with the crew that I had and start working toward some of those solutions. And we kind of did it piece by piece. It was a little slow at first, but I think once we started getting things going, it sort of snowballs and accelerates. So I'll talk a little bit about general principles. And then try to go into some of the specifics of putting it all together. And at the end, if we have time, I'd love to talk about a couple of the sort of big initiatives we're doing at the UW with regard to data acquisition. So the first thing that I think you really have to do is assess your resources. Figure out what kind of team what you can really do. So forgive me, I'm going to do a football analogy here. So. This is Peyton Manning, quarterback, and this is Adrian Peterson, running back. And the point I want to make here is, in football, there isn't a universal game plan. There isn't, here's the way you do it. You go into a game, and what's going to dictate your game plan is your personnel and your opponent. At least I think that's how it works. I'm hesitant to use that analogy because, in this context, the user is the opponent. It's probably not fair, but I had to look at my team and say, okay, I've got manual data entry. I've got a little bit of manual data entry. I have one developer who, does a specific kind of developing that is well suited for certain things and not for others. So there were certain things that I just could not do. So I had to put together a game plan based on what I had available. I know it seems obvious, but I think it's an important thing to kind of take inventory of what your capacity is, what your skill set is, and then try to come up with a plan that will work for that. So another big one is to try to determine how engaged your users are. One of the things I think we're really fortunate at the university is we have 300 users who are trained to. Yeah. So we have 600 users who look at the CRM, but we have 300 people that we said you can make updates of one kind or another in the database. So we have a pretty well engaged population of users who are trying to help us maintain the data. You know, as you probably guess, that's both good and bad. So figure out what your budget is for vendor-based solutions. There are a ton of them out there. Some are really good, some are not. So I try to figure out what you can afford, and then I think you can kind of work backward from there. And after you've established your priorities, start to fit those pieces in, and then look to see where you have growth opportunities. And I think of growth in both long-term and short-term. So one of the things I did in our records management group is I tried to find, are there places where I can kind of use other, the gift processors or student callers to do some of our work during, at times of where we get spikes in updates and updated requests. And in exchange for that, the deal is sort of I want to try to take some work from them and make some of their work easier. So if you could look for places where you have the opportunity to get short-term help, I think that's great. And then always have a game plan for when you can add positions or assume take on new people. So probably a little harder now, but I think Chris would probably agree with me here. Sometimes those opportunities just pop up, and if you're not ready to pounce on them, then somebody else gets it. So we had a situation at our work where we had approval to hire a developer, and then that became 2 developers, and we kind of jumped on it and said, what we really need is we need 1 developer, but we really need a business analyst. And because we kind of already had a plan for what the way we wanted to expand, we were kind of able to jump in there and I guess get first dibs on those positions. So hopefully we'll be hiring those pretty soon. All right, so this is conduct a data source inventory. And yes, I quoted Aerosmith up here. You don't have to be able to read this, but this is something I did where on the left column, I've listed out all of the different databases from which we get information to put into our CRM. In some of those, we have a few different jobs. So from the School of Medicine, we get information from Airlift Northwest. We get people from the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, Grateful Patients. From our Enterprise Data Warehouse, we get information about parents, about degrees, new degrees, about new students. So those are all it's kind of an inventory of everything we receive. And then across here, I've separated our CRM into the different domains in which we keep data. So, the obvious ones are like entity, their name, and that address, phone number, email. But then you get into things like, for us, we have degrees, obviously gifts. We get into activities and mailing codes for when we send stuff out to them. Events, clubs, volunteering, IDs. So I had to get a pretty good idea of what we're taking in and where it's going.
Will this presentation be available?
Oh yeah, sure. It will be?
Yes.
Okay. So having done that, then that's kind of the income. As important is to identify the outgoing information. Again, I'm super lucky. I get to, I'm one cubicle away from our reporting group and our training group and our training and support group. So, I can pop my head up and ask questions about, hey, what is our policy for how we're receiving this data, and then how is that being interpreted by the reporting group? And when you have too much information to take in, when you have the kind of, which I'm sure you all do. I'm sure you all have to make choices about what you're able to handle. I think the most important thing that you can ask yourself is, how is this actually going to be used? And if you can identify that someone's going to put this into a segment, someone's going to pull a report that's going to look at this, someone's going to do some analytics where this is going to be a factor, then then that's data that you want. But if it's, oh, well, this would be really nice to have, and we happen to have a source for it, so let's put it in there, and maybe someday we'll use it, then you know, maybe that doesn't mean you don't get it, but it becomes a lower priority. So I like to, this is a question I came up with. A little chuckle, that's good, right? My colleague Mark Lanham wanted me to say that data is like muscle. If you don't use it, as you use it, it gets stronger. I couldn't remember it, so I'm sorry about this. But this is really, turns out to be a good question to ask, because I'll get lots of people who say, you know, the law school comes to me and says, here, I've got all the employees, all the people who work, are a part of the Washington State Bar Association, and here's all their employment. And we think, oh, wow, that's great, yeah, let's get it in there. It's going to be kind of tough to figure out which one of them actually have a UW law degree and are in our database, but it seems like really interesting information. I kind of like it. But then I ask, so what are you going to do with it? I don't know. Are you like doing engagement with people at their work? No, not really. Are you looking for volunteers? No, we're not looking for volunteers. Do you want to add people who aren't alumni but happen to work for a local law firm? No, not really. We just kind of thought, you know, we got this list. So that becomes a low priority. It's just, as interesting as it sounded to me, it wasn't going to get used. And someday, if it is going to get used, it's going to move to the top of the list. So, I hope I'm getting to the end here. Okay, finding the pain points. This is easy for us. They're everywhere. It makes me sad sometimes when I'll sit down with a user and ask them, okay, how are you doing this? And I look at the way that they have to. Yesterday, I talked to someone who manages events for our alumni association, and here's what she has. She has people's name that they RSVP'd for an event, and she has their email. And their email, actually, the reason they even RSVP'd for the event is because there was a list sent out from our database to all the people with those emails. She has 430 of them, and she looks them up by hand, one by one, in the CRM, to find their ID number, so that she can then take that ID number and send it off to fundraisers, who can then request to have a code put into advance based on that ID number. And that takes her all day, and she just didn't know that. I said, well, geez, I can take this list and match it up on email addresses in 4 minutes and get you the ID numbers, and you don't even have to send it out to the fundraisers to then forward it onto the reporting group. We can just add the response code to the event code right then and there. So the lesson learned from me there is people just don't know what's possible, and I think a lot of times people don't want to ask because they don't want to. They probably think it's harder than it is. Part of that is, I think, the old IT culture of pretending that something was really hard to do. It took you all week, and oh my God, I can't believe you put me through that. When really you finished it on Monday, and then did some Facebooking or something. I don't know. Whatever the kids do these days. But yeah, so people tend to believe, oh, this is going to be really hard to do. I can't ask them to do that; they're so busy. But so you really have to go out there and look for those pain points. I try to meet regularly with our stewardship people, our research people, the gift processors. We have a corporate foundation relations team, and we have a kind of a regular meeting where we talk about, okay, what's going on, what's hurting right now, what could you use help with? Not that I'm really eager to go out and solicit work, but I've got to work, the team's got to work, and we might as well be working on what people need us working on, right? So, last point here is to really try to understand your users. And I guess getting a degree in the iSchool, that is the thing they emphasize the most. It's weird. It's almost like they're hostile to techies and technology at the high school. Everything is about the user. Nothing really matters unless it matters to the user. They're big on user experience. They're big on figuring out personas and designing your interfaces around that. So I guess I kind of inherited that. But to me, understanding your users boils down to being able to separate what they want or say they want and what they actually need. And it turns out that there's actually a big difference there. And I kind of already blew my law school anecdote here, but I think that's a good example of a group thinking, oh, well, this is what we want. A lot of times people will be, I try to not let them be prescriptive about what I should do in managing their data. I ask them, what's the end point? Where do you want to be? What do you want to get to? Because if you ask them, what do you want me to do? They'll lay out some, sort of plan for how you need to update their data and what kind of report you need to run. That might be the way they think is the easiest path to get there, but you probably know, with your experience, a different way to get there, a better way to get there. Maybe you can see that this isn't, where they think they want to go isn't. They sort of, people tend to limit themselves, I think. They think, well, I'll settle for this, not realizing that they can get more. This is a good one for reporting. That I think illustrates this is how many times have you had people request a report, and so they'll ask for all the people who've given to this fund between these dates, whatever, and I want their names and their addresses. And then after the fact, they're like, well, I really wanted the phone numbers too, but I didn't want to make it too complicated. And you're like, that's the easy part. I mean, figuring out who the cohort is, that takes some time, but actually giving the output is, I throw the kitchen sink in. I don't care if you want, we can put it in there. And conversely, how many times you get people saying, oh, I just want to count. As if you sort of magically know the number of people who attended events in 1997 for the Alumni Association in Pullman. So there's a disconnect there for people about what they think they can get out of the database. And it's really important that you hear what they're trying to do, not just what they're asking for, and then figure out a way to get there. So this slide is so boring, but I try to ask these questions, especially when I get someone saying, I've uncovered this new source of information and I want to put it in. The fact of the matter is databases the world over are littered with orphaned initiatives and good intentions. I can think of, off the top of my head, I did a huge project to get alumni of the Husky Marching Band into advance. It seemed like a pretty good one. The band director was really excited about it. They had someone who was going to, provide us the data. So we went through this matching project. We set up a bunch of code. We put them in there. That was 7 years ago and haven't heard from them since. I know there's no new marching band people in advance. And if I thought they were actually using it somehow, I'd probably go out and say, hey, we need to do this. But I know for a fact nobody's looking at it. So, we have an honor society, one of the honor societies, and kind of went through the same sort of project and ended up being orphaned. So,
How do you determine the usage?
What's that?
How do you determine the usage?
Oh, the usage? Oh, so this is an interesting one. Well, one way is if you don't have any new Husky marching band members for 7 years, and the Husky marching band director who requested the data hasn't noticed that, then he's probably not using it. But another thing that we do, and again, I think I'm really fortunate here, is our reporting group, they track everything. So I can see what codes are being requested to be used in reports. I can see who actually is being pulled into segments and reports. We don't get, I think there's a lot of stuff we miss. We don't necessarily get every kind of usage that people get out of their data, but in general terms, I can see who's getting used for projects and who isn't, and what codes are turning out to be relevant. We had a
Your retention by data request, right?
yeah.
So it's not some kind of log that tracks the query.
No.
Profiler.
Well, no, not really. Although we have an online reporting application, so people can pull down data, and we get to see what they're pulling there. One of the things that we've figured out, especially having so many different departments and users in so many different contexts sending out to people. We know there are people affiliated with the University of Washington who are getting, I don't know, what would you say, 80, 90 pieces of mail from us a year, a lot of them. So figuring out who those people are and trying to assess, whether or not that's appropriate and what timing looks like is really important to us. So we try to track all the requests. Now we don't necessarily know, people can request a mailing list and then not send to it, or they can request a count of something and then end up using it in 3 different mailings or something. So it's it's not bulletproof to figure that out. But, so is there a sponsor or steward for the data? Is there someone who really wants to work with this information? Do I have a static source for it? I love having a static source that I can just connect to and pull the data over myself. So if someone says, "Oh, don't worry, I'll collect all these cocktail napkins from the professors that have all the names of all these people and then put it in a spreadsheet for you," I mean, I hope that that's what you want to do, but I'm not going to bank on it. Whereas if I have, a static source that I can go to and get the information, that's kind of a slam dunk for us. We interface now with KEXP, the radio station, the awesome radio station, and they get, I think they have 70, 80,000 people in their database, and we're now loading all of those gift credits into our database. It's a kind of a huge undertaking for us. We wouldn't even consider it if it was going to be, we sort of happenstance have to figure out when we can get those gift loads from them. So the fact that we're able to connect with them, that we've set up a process for regular exchange of that information is huge for us. It makes it so much easier to process the data when you know when to expect it and what to expect. No.
So we just get whatever
Because
they
we're
cover.
technically the same organization. So we run into definitely more privacy issues with student data, with FERPA and with HIPAA, but not. And with the KXP data, I mean, we're actually processing their gifts now, so it's
So
kind
you
of,
provide actual service,
Yeah,
so you're
yeah.
part of it.
KXP is actually an offshoot of the old UW radio station. I don't quite know the history. I think Paul Allen, local bazillionaire, put a lot of money into it because he wanted to meet rock stars.
Yeah, he put a grant in there.
Okay. So, do I trust the source? Is it comprehensive? The comprehensive thing is pretty important. If I have to know if I'm getting partial data. That is, again, like I said earlier, I hate implying that there's complete data there. Some people say, well, if you have some of it, that's better than none. In some cases, that's true. But what happens is, people look at something and say, oh, I see you have, all the women's volleyball players, and so they pull that list thinking they have everyone, and they don't, and nobody knows them. So, what product outcomes depend on the data? I kind of talked about this earlier, but if you know there's something that people are going to use this for, that tends to help make sure that the data gets in there. And then looking at the tempo for refreshing the information. There are some things that we do on a daily basis in our CRM. There's some things that are weekly, some that are monthly, quarterly, and annual. And that's kind of an important factor for me too. If it's something that we can live with a quarterly, refreshing of the data, and that doesn't really affect people. Degrees are a good example of that. I don't need to go out and look for degrees every day. I can kind of do that on a quarterly basis, and that's fine. In new hires and employees at the University of Washington, it'd be nice to know those on a daily basis, but people are generally happy if we have a 1 week turnaround. So knowing that I have one project that's quarterly and one that's weekly helps me kind of manage where that's going to sit in the priority list. And then I try to look for overlap. Sometimes you'll get a project from someone and you realize, oh, hey, this is the same source that somebody wanted this other thing. Maybe I can kind of combine these things and put them together and sort of edge things up the priority list that way. So I'm going pretty slow here. I think I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. I've talked a lot about defining the priorities, and establishing the service level agreement is another big one. I'll just say briefly, when I took over the updates group and we had a big backlog, the first thing I knew I wanted to be able to say, just from talking to users who didn't trust us at all, I wanted to be able to say with confidence, if you send us a request, it's going to be processed in 2 days, period. It's just going to be done. You'll know that it's done. And the way we got there was by finding the things that we didn't need to do. They were taking returned mail and processing those as bad addresses in the database. What we figured out, we can use NCOA to maintain data, so then we're getting fewer pieces of returned mail. And then one of the things we instituted is we started twice a year now. We call it a tracer postcard, but it looks like a holiday card. And in the spring we send a thank you card. But one of the things on it is I've requested electronic returns from the post office, so they'll tell me if that card didn't get delivered or if it had to be forwarded. So do people here do national change of address updates into their, most important? One of the things you don't get there that's harder to get is when people don't file, or when an event happens that they can't file, like the deceased or divorced or something like that. Or if you acquire data and the information is so old, so bad that you don't, it's the change of address is expired. So one of the things the tracer allows us to do is identify those pieces of mail that aren't getting through. We pull those people out into a different status, then we initiate some research on those, and maybe they get back into our CRM, but we segregate them out. So we went from being about 78% deliverable to 98% deliverable. So I can tell people if I'm giving you an address and saying I think this one is good, it's going to get there, and then that just eliminated return mail. So that's one way that we started to be able to focus on different requests and really accelerate that turnaround time. It took a while, but that service level agreement is big for us because I want people to be confident that their work is getting done. And then I talk about this a lot, but incentivizing this data. It's only good if people are using it, and really try to connect the stuff you're updating with the reports that are being produced, the analytics that people can do. Emphasize real-time kinds of things. If I can let people know in real time that their prospects are getting married or divorced or getting new jobs, or if we can pull deceased people out sooner, then that's a big incentive for people. If they know that they can get access to that information quicker, then they're going to be much more excited about maintaining it. Relinquishing ownership. I asked this question of our database administrator. He's kind of curmudgeon. I like him, but who owns the database? Well, of course, the database administrator owns the data, right? So I think that's not true. But I asked him what constitutes a good phone number. This is his actual answer was it should be 10 digits, preferably without punctuation. The area code needs to correspond to the blah, blah, blah. I asked one of the users, in our case a regional giving fundraiser, who was at the table, what constitutes a good phone number, and her answer is, and that's what you're going for. Don't get hung up on the 10 characters and the punctuation. I mean, that stuff's important, but ultimately what you're going for is this useful information? It doesn't matter how well formed it is if it's not useful information. And so for me, I had to get over this sort of this hump of I'm going to relinquish this data to our users and let them maintain it. That was a little bit hard for me. It was really hard for the updaters, for our professional data entry people. They just hate the idea of somebody being able to decease a record or marry a couple. So some of the things we do, we train people. We have a great training program, but there are certain things that you just don't do often enough that you're going to remember from your training 7 months ago how to do. So we kind of assume that not all that training is going to take, and we try to control inputs for people, and we also, I promised a colleague, Jessica, that I would use her this clip art that she made. It's hard to see, but these are people cultivating their TMS controlled vocabulary codes. Jessica made those. Is Jessica here? Okay, good. And then we audit everything. So now I'm going to probably, I think, try to fly through some of the stuff that we actually do at the University of Washington. Exposing the data, warts and all. I think sometimes people have a tendency to hide things, to bury them under the carpet. I do it myself. If I have a bad address, I put it in lost status, and maybe I'm researching it, maybe I'm not, but I'm certainly not sending it to people. But I do think it's useful in your reporting to show people, the things they didn't get. If somebody has a list that they're renewing often, we have like a donor recognition list. Show people the people who were on that list last year and aren't on it this year, so they can look and see is there some reason why this person isn't on there that I need to pay attention to. If you have, I demoed our reporting application the other day, and it showed that I had, this is out of 800,000 records in our database, but we had 6 people who were coded as defunct. Defunct is a code that we use for businesses. So those are obviously wrong. But the fact that people can see that, I think it is, it's not great, but I think it's better to show that and turn it into an opportunity to fix it. So, and then I guess this is the part where I kind of wanted to talk to people about some of the things you're doing, and I think, I'm sorry I kind of went long here, but these are some of the things that we do data hygiene-wise at the University of Washington. Now, I kind of wanted to find out from people what they do. I'm not certain that we have a lot of time here, but I talked a little bit about our NCOA ACS process. For deceasing, we subscribe to, does anybody here subscribe to like a obituary registry? Or, those are pretty good. They search through obituaries and look for your organization in there. One of the other things we do though is we do screen scraping from the Tacoma News Tribune and the Seattle Times on their obituaries. So we pull off everybody locally and then see if we can find them in our database. Some of the things we don't do really well are phone and email. I think we've started doing some email append and trying to segregate those, but I wouldn't say it's something we do really well. Employment's also obviously really hard. We have a really nice audit application at the University of Washington. It's kind of a collection of stored procedures where we go through and look for conditions in the database that look suspicious. And then we distribute those to users, mostly gift processors, but also our updates team, to try to get them to address that right away. Exception reporting, we have a lot of legacy exception reporting, but I get 70 emails a night that are just exception reports. I don't really look at them. I kind of go with our audit application. One of the nice things about the audit application, something I think works really well is access. If you can get like a sort of copy of your production database as a reporting database, I don't know, it's a little riskier to connect to production data, but you can still do it. You can write your own queries in Access. Our research group has a bunch of queries that they just kind of look at periodically and go in and fix it. It's really not that hard to do, but it's kind of a good bang for your buck. We prioritize the audits. So this is something we came up with for how we prioritize the different audits we do. So there's the likelihood of exposure and the impact of exposure. And obviously the ones on the top right, high impact, high likelihood, those are the ones that are ending up being important. So I kind of rephrase this as, will someone notice? Will they care? And are they important? So this guy has redundant employment rows. That's me, by the way. So I use myself as the unimportant person. If I have a redundant employment row, that's probably not going to get noticed. But if you have Phil and Belinda Gates in your database, that's going to get noticed, and that's probably not going to go over well. So that's got to be a priority 1 fix. And so on a daily basis, we're having people address the priority 1 fixes. And then you have to look at your data acquisition. The big thing I wanted to talk about here was matching. I think that's the kind of the big challenge for people. It's easy to go to a source and extract the data, kind of transform it and get it ready to put into your database. And for a lot of CRMs are pretty good load tools. The hard part is actually matching those external records up to your database. In my case, I have 800,000 records in my database. So when I get 70,000 records from KXP and I got to figure out if they're in there, that's a pretty big job. How long? What time am I supposed to end?
Got about another 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, great. So one of the things that we're doing at the University of Washington is we're building our own kind of ETL enterprise system for taking data from all those different sources identified, and we use the store procedures and the triggers from our CRM to load that data. It's kind of boring, but the big difference for us here is that we're decoupling the actual technology from the data. I don't care what format I get it in. It can be a spreadsheet, it can be a connection to a server, it can be a web service, it could be a user upload. I'm going to take that and sort of generically blow up the data. I'll take the name and I parse it out into its components. I barcode all the addresses, and then I take all of that information and run it through a bunch of match algorithms to try to find people in our database. End up with 3 piles. The ones that definitely matched, the ones that just aren't in there. They might be in there, but you don't have enough information to know that. Good example here is if I have, Jane Doe, alum, and then she moved and got married and changed jobs, and I get Jane Smith from the external match, I'm not going to match that unless I have something else besides the first name. It's just not going to happen. So this is kind of what the application looks like for us. I like it because we just started deploying. So this is a user can go through these screens to upload a file, look at the data they've put in there. They can actually map their fields and say this is a name, this is an address. But then one of the cool things that happens is it goes through a match algorithm and then presents back to the user their match jobs. So they can see, here I've got the people that were uploaded externally, and you can kind of go through and look at the data individually. This happens to be for KXP. This is how we did the KXP match. And then we present to them the choices of what we think, we found this person, same last name, same address, different first name, and the person can basically select, is that match? In this case, it's not. They look at some additional information, kind of figure out that they think it's the spouse, and so they say no match, create the entity, and they can indicate spouse. And the cool thing about this is as soon as they make that decision, that entity gets pushed into our CRM and actually gets created. And the information from KXP gets put into that database. If they happen to be married to Gary, then Gary's going to get a soft credit for that, yeah. So I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about this taxonomy, so I'm just going to skip it. But at least I get to show this cool graphic having up band names. I'll probably leave it up there. But another project that we're working on is trying to assign to a unit every single code that we have in the CRM. That means degree codes, gift codes, event codes, mailing list codes, allocations, everything. So that in crafting a request for data, a user can basically just say semantically, I want people who have an interest in the humanities. And that becomes basically like a 4-line query to pull out what might actually be 75 different codes in our database. Not going to really get to talk about that. So.
Is that a custom application? You write that from scratch? Or
Which one?
Oh,
yeah. Yes. So what we did is we hijacked the store procedures in advance. But instead of saying, so in advance, in the web version of our CRM, when you do something in the web front end, it sort of calls the store procedure to affect that into the database. So what I did is I took that table structure and said, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to seed data in there in batches, and then call those same store procedures to do it. So it's as if a user put it in there. The part that we really developed was getting data, pulling it apart and then putting it back together for matching purposes. We try to apply our business logic. So what we replicate in machine language is we try to figure out what would the user do. So, a user can intuitively figure out matching a lot better than a machine. A user is going to know, where the first name ends and the middle name begins. So those are the things that we try to replicate and then put in the database. And then the big thing here is to try to get economy of scale. If someone comes to me and says, I have 37 people I'm going to upload into Advance, that's kind of a pain for me to try to do that. But if they can upload that file and just merge it onto the freeway with 27 other people who have a 35-person job, and that all just goes in through the same process, that's where we get the benefit. And then the payoff for us is we're trying to do as much as we can in real time, because what we really want to do is be able to display that back to people immediately. I want fundraisers to come in the morning and have a dashboard that is like a news feed, like Twitter or Facebook, that is telling them, so-and-so had their job updated. This person just RSVP'd for this event. So they can kind of tell us who they're interested in, what kinds of things they're interested in, and then start seeing that in real time so they can so it becomes actionable intelligence. Does it no good to know that somebody was going to come to an event if the event already, if you don't load that into the database until after the event's over? Okay, sorry, I don't have much time for questions. Thanks for coming up.
One quick note before we give Mike a nice warm thank you is that we have these sheets that are sitting in front of you that are a little bit of a session scorecard. If you could fill that out and leave them at the end of the table, I'll come by and collect those afterwards. That's the last thing separating you from another cup of coffee or a pastry. Also, Mike's contact information is available inside the packet, along with everybody else's that's attending the conference. And I urge you to take advantage of that. One thing that Mike is well known for on our campus, and I think certainly within our industry, is he's very generous with his time and his advice. And he's seen from small scale to large scale, limited projects to big enterprise level ones. So I really encourage you guys to reach out to Mike for any of that additional information. We have a break from now till about 11:30. If you look inside your package, you'll see the next two events that are coming up online. One will be from a fundraiser's perspective, which is in this room, and then we also have one on data modeling, which will be next door. So Mike, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I feel bad I didn't get into a lot of the specific stuff, but if you have any interest, feel free to call me.